was the winter of 1945. Europe lay in silence, its cities reduced to broken bones and ash. The war was crawling to its end, yet for millions the nightmare had only begun. Across the ruins of the Reich, surrender was no longer a choice, it was survival. Columns of prisoners trudged through the cold, their uniforms tattered, their futures uncertain. And among them were faces that few ever spoke about, the women of the defeated army. They had served in offices, in factories, and field hospitals. Some carried rifles, others carried messages, but all had carried the weight of a collapsing nation. When the Allied trucks came, there was no defiance left in them, only exhaustion. They climbed aboard with trembling hands, eyes hollow from hunger and fear, and the rumors whispered through their ranks like a chill wind, that the Americans were merciless, that prisoners were beaten, starved, or vanished into nameless camps beyond the sea. That captivity was worse than death. No one dared to speak. Engines growled. Tires bit into the mud. Each mile carried them farther from the wreckage they had called home, and deeper into the unknown mercy of their conquerors. When the trucks finally stopped, dusk had already fallen. The women expected shouting, the crack of boots, the sting of humiliation. Instead, they were met by silence. The camp stood before them in perfect lines, rows of wooden barracks, fences that gleamed in the moonlight, and guards who did not raise their voices. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't hell either. It was something strange, an order that felt almost humane. They were handed blankets, bread, and hot coffee. For a moment, none of them moved. To be treated with dignity, even as prisoners, ground was so foreign it felt like a trick. Inside the barracks, they found clean bunks and fresh sheets. The air smelled faintly of soap, not the rot of cellars where they had once hidden from the bombings. Some cried quietly. Others stared, unable to trust what their eyes told them. Here, behind wire and watchtowers, they were no longer soldiers or enemies, only women. And as the days passed, the strangeness deepened. Letters were censored but delivered. Meals were regular. Guards nodded instead of shouted. It was captivity wrapped in civility, a contradiction too vast to understand after years of war and hate. They had been taught that compassion was weakness. Now, in the hands of their conquerors, they were beginning to unlearn it. For some, that realization was more disorienting than defeat itself. Because in this strange corner of America's war machine, they discovered something that neither propaganda nor fear had prepared them for: humanity. They stepped from the trucks, hesitant, their hands clutching the small bundles they had managed to save. The gravel crunched beneath their shoes, and the faint smell of wood smoke and pine drifted toward them. They expected chaos, cages shouting cruelty, but instead the camp unfolded before their eyes in a quiet, measured order. Wooden barracks lined in straight rows, doors open, interiors visible from the outside. The women froze, their breath catching as they stared at neatly made beds, blankets folded precisely at the foot, pillows fluffed and pristine. In Germany, even sheets had been a luxury. Bombed-out homes, ruined apartments, basements turned into shelters. They had slept on hard floors, huddled together to keep warm, listening to distant thunder of collapsing buildings. And now in the heart of captivity, they saw beds, real beds, inviting, soft, impossible. A few of the younger women exchanged furtive glances, shame flickering across their faces at the relief coursing through them. Hope, they knew, was dangerous. Yet as they were led into the barracks, their fear began to fray thread by thread. The air inside smelled faintly of soap and pine, disciplined and clean. The bunks were spaced apart, allowing room to move, to breathe, a simple consideration that spoke louder than words. Each woman was directed to a bed. No shoving, no barking commands. They placed their bundles gently on the blankets, half expecting it to vanish or be ripped away. But the mattresses sank under their weight. The sheets were real. Some whispered prayers. Others collapsed onto the beds, their bodies finally letting go of years of tension, of terror, of the constant anticipation of pain. Even the simplest arrangements carried weight. Each bunk was a small island of dignity, separated by neat aisles allowing privacy they had not known in years. Outside, the camp moved with quiet precision. Guards walked their patrols with methodical footsteps, rifles carried but never aimed. Barbed wire fences loomed in the distance, but even they were tidy, not jagged, rusted, or threatening. The camp exuded control rather than cruelty, a strange inversion of what the women had been led to expect. The sunlight slanted through the barracks, casting golden streaks across the dust in the air, and the women sat on their bunks, stunned, listening to muffled voices, distant boots, the gentle clatter of utensils in the mess hall. "Is this truly captivity?" one whispered. Another shook her head, eyes wide. The question lingered in the still air, unanswered. Years of deprivation had honed their senses to anticipate danger. Yet here, there was nothing immediate to fear. The chaos of war, the collapsing roofs, the wailing sirens, the empty stomachs, seemed a world away. Yet what they were seeing, what they were feeling was real. The shock of the unexpected, the order, the care, the simple provision of space, unraveled their tight grip on despair. Relief mixed with disbelief, and they could hardly trust their own reactions. Some lingered at the foot of the bunks, tracing the edges of the folded blankets with trembling fingers, as though confirming the existence of a reality they had thought lost forever. Beyond beds and barracks, other small miracles revealed themselves. Fresh water flowed in basins, clear and cold against their skin, a sensation they had not known for months, even years. They could wash, clean their clothes, mend what was torn. Tasks that seemed mundane became profound acts of restoration. Personal hygiene, once impossible to maintain, returned a measure of control over their bodies and their lives. Even the food carried the same weight. Bread, soup, and sometimes meat, a bounty compared to the thin rations back home, were placed on trays with care, offered without scorn or derision. The aroma alone made their stomachs ache with hunger, anticipation, and disbelief. They lined up, hesitant, eyes darting, and then began to eat. Quietly at first, as if fearing the meal would disappear mid-bite, then more freely, greedily even. For some, tears blurred their vision. To eat without fear, to taste something rich, nourishing, life-giving was almost too much to bear. And as the warmth of broth slid down their throats, they remembered a fragment of life they had thought extinguished. Before air raids, before hunger, before the collapse of everything familiar. It was more than sustenance. It was a reawakening, and in this act, they began to see the subtle humanity of the people who had captured them. The women began to whisper cautiously, trading small, stunned observations about the care shown, the order maintained, the absence of cruelty. Each act of restraint, each small kindness, challenged every story they had been told, every warning ingrained by propaganda. Their captors, they realized slowly, were not monsters. They were human beings following their duty, but with a measure of conscience. The paradox struck them with full force. Enemies offering care, captors giving dignity. By the end of that first day, as the sun dipped low and the shadows lengthened across the neat paths, the women felt something they had not in years, a fragile sense of safety. They were still prisoners, yes, but the terror that had dominated their lives for so long had been muted. For the first time in months, perhaps years, they allowed themselves to breathe deeply, to sink into a bed that held them, to feel the warmth of food in their stomachs, to notice the quiet rhythm of a world moving in careful order. It was not freedom, but it was not torment either. It was survival wrapped in a strange, unexpected grace. Food became more than sustenance. It became revelation. For the German women who had endured years of scarcity and ration survival, each meal in the American camps was a reminder of a world they had thought vanished forever. Back home, hunger had dictated life. By late 1944, bread was dry and sparse, meat nearly a memory, and potatoes, the last staple, were precious commodities. Mothers had cried silently while their children slept empty-stomached, and the women themselves had grown accustomed to stretching meager rations, boiling weeds when nothing else remained, and sharing what little they had to stave off starvation. Hunger had become an ever-present shadow, a quiet companion in the ruins of Germany. So when they first lined up for meals at the camps, fear clung to them as tightly as the bundles they carried. They expected thin gruel, stale bread, or worst of all, deliberate deprivation. Rumors of American cruelty to prisoners had circulated for months, whispered warnings of starvation, of punishment through scarcity. But the moment the aroma hit their noses, those fears wavered. The air was thick with the rich scent of simmering vegetables, warm bread, and at times meat, aromas so vivid they almost seemed unreal. Some of the women inhaled sharply, stomachs contracting with anticipation, disbelief etched across their pale, hollow faces. When trays were distributed, their astonishment deepened. On the plain metal plates lay bowls of soup, steaming and fragrant, thick with carrots, potatoes, and occasionally lentils or beans. Bread, Soft in the center with just the slightest crust rested beside it. Occasionally a slice of meat appeared, a luxury so unthinkable it brought whispers of disbelief and cautious awe. The women hesitated at first, hands shaking over spoons, afraid to believe this simple act could be real. But as they tasted the first spoonfuls, silence fell over the mess hall, broken only by the gentle clatter of utensils. Slowly, that silence dissolved into murmured astonishment, then quiet laughter, then unrestrained hunger. Soup disappeared quickly, bread torn and devoured with a ferocity born of years without, until some sat back, hands trembling, eyes wet with tears, finally satiated. The meals carried more than calories. They carried reassurance. Each spoonful was a reminder that life could exist beyond fear, that the world could still hold order, kindness, and the promise of tomorrow. Women who had been skeletal upon arrival began to see the color return to their cheeks. Muscles stiffened, hands once trembling from weakness steadied. They learned slowly to trust the rhythm of a day that included 3 reliable meals, clean water, and a space of their own. Even the act of eating together, sharing tables in rows without fear, became a quiet ritual of collective humanity. The steam rising from bowls, the aroma of bread, the rhythmic spooning of soup, these became acts of grace in a world that had forgotten such things. Yet along with nourishment came unease. Some of the women felt guilt as they ate, thinking of family members left behind, scraping scraps in bombed-out kitchens. They whispered apologies to the empty spaces of their homes, lamenting the disparity between their comfort and the suffering outside the camp fences. Still, hunger always returned, insistent and unyielding, and they ate, recognizing that survival demanded it, even if conscience pulled at them. Food also became a bridge. Younger women, emboldened by relief and curiosity, exchanged tentative words with American cooks and guards, their halting English met with patient smiles and gestures of understanding. Through bread and soup, an unspoken recognition of shared humanity emerged. The rigid boundaries of enemy and captive blurred, revealing the paradox of kindness from those who had once been painted as monsters. As days passed, the physical restoration brought emotional and moral clarity. Hunger, fear, and deprivation had dulled their perception of human decency. Now each simple act, being allowed to wash, to repair clothes, to sit at a table without intimidation, became transformative. They began to see dignity not as a luxury but as a right, granted quietly through order, consistency, and restraint. The very captors they had been warned to hate were demonstrating day after day that humanity could survive even in the shadow of war. Evenings in the camp carried the same rhythm. After the last meal, women returned to their barracks, some tending to chores, others writing letters they doubted would ever reach home. Yet in the routine, they discovered a fragile sense of continuity, a reassurance that time could pass without violence or deprivation dictating its pace. Conversations, once limited to survival instructions or whispered complaints, shifted toward reflection, memories of the past, contemplation of the war, and quiet acknowledgement of the paradox that they were safer here than in Germany. By the end of the first month, disbelief began to soften into acceptance. The food, the order, the quiet restraint of guards, all of it became the framework of a new reality. They were prisoners, yes, but they were prisoners in a place that had, against all expectations, restored parts of their humanity. With each meal, each clean bunk, each act of measured kindness, they began to reconstruct a sense of self that war had fractured. They were learning, in the midst of captivity, that survival could coexist with dignity, that care could emerge from the hands of those once deemed enemies, and that the human spirit, even in the darkest years, could still recognize and respond to grace. Beyond food and shelter came something even more unexpected: dignity. For the German women, dignity had been stripped away long before they ever entered captivity. In their homeland, air raids had forced them into darkened basements, trembling while the world above them burned. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble, families torn apart, and soldiers had barked orders through the streets, indifferent to human suffering. To be German in those final years of the war was to endure hunger, fear, and loss as constant companions. By the time they were captured, most expected the worst: humiliation, cruelty, degradation at the hands of their captors. Yet the moment they entered the American camps, the reality they found was almost impossible to reconcile with the horrors they had imagined. The guards patrolling the camp carried rifles, yes, but their eyes were steady, not cruel. Their voices were firm, but never mocking or demeaning. They did not shove, strike, or bark orders. Instead, they gave instructions in a controlled, measured tone. The goal seemed not to terrify, but to maintain order. For women who had been conditioned to anticipate brutality at every turn, this restraint was shocking. Many whispered to each other that it must be an act, that eventually the Americans would reveal the cruelty they had been told to expect. But as the days passed, the anticipated violence never materialized. Instructions were repeated calmly, gestures guided movement, and the soldiers' watchfulness carried no malice. When the women were told to step into the barracks, they braced themselves for punishment, shoves, slaps, shouted commands, but were met instead with simple motioning toward the open doors. One young woman recalled waiting for a reprimand simply for walking too slowly, only to find the soldier beside her was patient, waiting quietly. Small, almost imperceptible moments like these became monumental in their eyes. In a world that had taught them fear at every step, patience and measured guidance felt revolutionary. Daily routines reinforced this sense of restored humanity. Beds were made, personal space respected, and lines of order carried the weight of dignity rather than oppression. There were no arbitrary punishments, no humiliation, and no displays of unchecked authority. Instead, women were treated with an expectation of compliance, yes, but also of respect. For those who had been told all along that Americans were monsters, this was disarming. Some admitted privately that kindness unsettled them far more than cruelty ever could. They understood brutality. They had lived it. But measured care, even in captivity, was almost incomprehensible. The restoration of dignity extended beyond gestures and routine. Women were allowed, and sometimes encouraged, to tend to personal tasks, washing clothes, repairing garments, or simply organizing their small spaces. These tasks, seemingly trivial, carried profound significance. For years, their lives had been dictated by war, by scarcity, by chaos. The ability to take care of oneself, to maintain a semblance of order over one's own existence, was a quiet reclaiming of identity. Each woman, in performing these small acts, reasserted a part of herself that had been eroded by fear and necessity. Interaction with American personnel further reinforced this fragile trust. Exchanges were often brief, a nod, a smile, a word or two of encouragement, but they mattered. Young women, emboldened by repeated exposure, began experimenting with simple phrases of English, met with patient responses from the guards. Through these small acts of communication, the rigid line between captor and captive blurred. In gestures, words, and shared tasks, humanity revealed itself in subtle but undeniable ways. They began to recognize that even amid war, civility could persist. Evenings in the camp brought quieter forms of dignity. After meals and chores, women often gathered in small groups, sharing stories of the past, whispering worries for those left behind, or simply sitting in the stillness of a barracks free from fear of bombardment or abuse. There was no hierarchy beyond necessity, no cruelty imposed for amusement, and no arbitrary infliction of suffering. The rhythm of camp life, though regimented, was humane. It allowed time to reflect, to heal, and to imagine life beyond mere survival. For many, the realization settled slowly. Like the dust in the sunlight that filtered through the barrack windows, captivity did not have to mean degradation. Order could exist without cruelty. Authority could coexist with respect. Even as prisoners, they were acknowledged as human beings, capable of thought, feeling, and agency. The smallest acts, a kindly gesture from a guard, a well-tended bunk, the consistency of meals became symbols of a restored world, fragment by fragment, in the midst of a shattered one. By the end of their first weeks, the women began to internalize this strange paradox. They were prisoners, yet they felt a measure of control over their own lives. They were under watch, yet they were treated with care. They were captives, yet their humanity was recognized piece by piece, day by day. Dignity, once thought lost, was quietly returned, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of countless small, deliberate acts. It was in the way instructions were given calmly, in the predictability of routines, in the unspoken acknowledgement that every individual mattered. For many German women, these early days in the American camps became the foundation of memory, a paradoxical space where captivity and care coexisted. Years later, when recounting their experiences, They would speak not first of fences or orders, but of the unexpected restoration of dignity, the way human decency could persist even amidst war, the way small acts could rebuild the soul, and the quiet lessons of patience, respect, and trust that survived long after the guns had fallen silent. Daily life in the camps held a rhythm that slowly reshaped the German women who lived behind the wire. When they first arrived, they had expected chaos, cruelty, or a timeless limbo, where days bled into one another in fear and confusion. Instead, they discovered structure, a carefully orchestrated system that provided pattern, purpose, and an unexpected stability. The camp ran on routines, each hour delineated by simple, predictable tasks: waking, roll call, meals, chores, and lights out. It was regimented, yes, but it was also humane. The predictability itself was transformative. For women who had spent years waiting, hungry, and afraid, the certainty of schedules became a kind of lifeline. At first, some resisted it. Years of survival under bombardment and scarcity had taught them that structure was often an illusion, a trap, or a prelude to punishment. They approached daily routines cautiously, unsure if compliance would be rewarded or punished. Guards did not need to threaten or enforce harshly. Their mere consistency was enough to teach the women that this system was different. Orders were clear, simple, and non-abusive. Disputes among the prisoners were handled firmly but without violence, a balance of authority and restraint that was unfamiliar yet quietly reassuring. Slowly, the women began to internalize the rhythm of life in captivity, and with it, a sense of control over their own existence. Conversations between prisoners, too, evolved in subtle ways. At first, whispers were cautious, laden with suspicion and uncertainty. But as the women observed the steady, calm order of the camp, trust grew incrementally. Not trust in freedom, not yet, but trust in the predictability of their environment. They began to share small details about their pasts, about families they had left behind, and about the fears that had accompanied them through bombed-out streets and shattered cities. The act of speaking, of being listened to without ridicule or interruption, became a quiet form of healing. Some women found solace in small rituals, folding clothes precisely, washing hands carefully, or simply sitting in the sunlight spilling through the barrack windows. Each act, while mundane, carried symbolic weight. It was a reclamation of order, of autonomy, of self. Camaraderie developed slowly as shared experience forged bonds. Women began to help one another with chores, share advice about managing the daily tasks, or offer quiet encouragement to those still trembling from exhaustion. In the absence of overt threat, solidarity blossomed naturally. The relationships were pragmatic at first, necessary alliances to navigate camp life, but over time, genuine empathy grew. Many discovered a sense of community they had not known since before the war, a rare feeling of being seen and acknowledged. In those moments, even amid captivity, they glimpsed fragments of life before destruction, fragments they could carry forward. Education and work within the camp also contributed to transformation. Women were sometimes assigned tasks in kitchens, laundries, or workshops, which gave them purpose and allowed them to contribute to the functioning of the camp. These tasks were not punishment. They were responsibilities, simple yet empowering. The work became a way to reclaim agency, a method of participating in life rather than merely enduring it. The American officers overseeing these activities expected diligence but also patience and fairness. There was no humiliation, no arbitrary assertion of power. The women learned skills, managed tasks, and began to take pride in small accomplishments, an experience that was both foreign and exhilarating. Recreational opportunities, though limited, became vital lifelines for morale. Occasional sports, small cultural activities, and opportunities for quiet conversation offered brief respites from the monotony of captivity. In these moments, laughter returned, hesitant at first, then more genuine. The sound of voices unguarded, of shared amusement, reminded them that life could hold pleasure even in confinement. Women would recount later that these fleeting episodes were among the most precious experiences of their time in the camps. The war had stripped them of innocence and joy, but here, in carefully supervised freedom, they began to reclaim fragments of both. Sleep, once elusive and haunted by fear, became restorative. In the early days, many lay awake on their bunks, listening for imagined threats in the quiet of the barracks. But as weeks passed, confidence in the camp's order allowed them to relax. to close their eyes without fear of sudden violence. The mind and body, starved of stability for so long, slowly remembered what it meant to rest. This quiet recovery, invisible to the casual observer, was among the most profound forms of healing. Psychologically, the women began to transform. The shock of captivity gave way to acceptance, then adaptation. They were not free, but they were safe. They were watched, yet they were respected. They were punished only when necessary, never for humiliation's sake. This balance reshaped their perception of power, authority, and humanity itself. For the first time in years, they could imagine a future beyond the immediate horizon of survival. Hope, fragile but persistent, began to take root. By the time several months had passed, the women had changed. They walked taller, spoke with steadier voices, and navigated the camp's routines with quiet confidence. Their understanding of themselves evolved alongside their understanding of the Americans who guarded them. The lessons of civility, patience, and respect had been seared into their consciousness, contradicting every fear and prejudice they had carried from Germany. They learned in ways both subtle and profound that captivity need not be synonymous with dehumanization, that dignity could survive even in war, and that humanity could exist across enemy lines. For many German women, these months became the foundation of their post-war memory, not only of the barracks, the meals, or the order of camp life, but of a slow, painstaking education in resilience, empathy, and self-respect. They learned to live again, to trust again, and to believe, however tentatively, that life could be both bearable and meaningful, even after devastation. The American camps paradoxically became classrooms in humanity, teaching lessons that would endure far longer than the war itself. As months passed, the German women began to grasp the rhythms of the camp and, in doing so, rediscovered a sense of self they had long thought lost. Each day brought predictability, each meal a lesson in care, each small task an affirmation that they were more than shadows of themselves. Yet even as they adapted to this strange stability, the looming question of release hovered in the back of every mind. When would they leave? What would await them beyond the fences? Would the world remember the chaos they had fled? Or had it moved on indifferent to their suffering? The first signs of change were subtle. Notices appeared on barrack doors, brief instructions about upcoming inspections or preparations. Guards spoke of transfers, of paperwork, of schedules that hinted at a life beyond the camp walls. Rumors, carefully whispered from one woman to another, began to circulate. Some feared the worst, that release would be chaotic, that freedom might bring punishment, or that they would return to the ruins of Germany only to find nothing left of their former lives. Others dared to hope quietly, almost ashamedly, that release would mean home, family, and a chance to live again without fear. Preparations for departure were methodical. The women were instructed to sort their belongings, to pack what little they had acquired during captivity. Even this was structured with care. Valuables, personal items, and essential clothing were carefully catalogued, and women were given clear instructions on what could be taken and what had to remain. For many, this process was emotional. Objects once deemed insignificant, a neatly folded handkerchief, a photograph of a sibling, a well-worn book, suddenly became treasures to carry forward. Packing became an act of reclaiming identity, a quiet assertion that they were more than prisoners. They were individuals whose lives had meaning, whose histories mattered. The final days were marked by a strange mix of anticipation and reflection. Women walked the familiar paths of the camp, now seeing details they had once overlooked. The neat alignment of barracks, the clean edges of the walkways, even the distant fences took on new significance. Every element of the camp, once seen as restrictive, now seemed protective, almost maternal in its careful order. The very environment that had once been a cage now felt like a bridge, a place where they had been slowly restored, physically and mentally, to life beyond war. When the day of departure arrived, it was quiet, almost ceremonial. Guards offered assistance, their gestures deliberate and steady, helping with bundles, guiding lines, ensuring that no one was lost in confusion. There was no haste, no shouting, no reminder of captivity. The calm professionalism of the Americans, observed for months within the camp, extended even to the final moments. Many women paused at the threshold of the camp, turning back to glance at the barracks, the mess hall, and the orderly paths that had sheltered them. There was gratitude, though mingled with disbelief. It was strange to leave a prison and feel a measure of respect, even care, from those who had held them there. Stepping beyond the gates, the sunlight struck differently than it had in the barracks. It was harsh and blinding, but also full of possibility. Women squinted, shielding their eyes, yet in that very act they felt alive in a way they had not in years. The fences behind them were no longer a prison, but a boundary they had crossed and would never forget. Each step toward the vehicles waiting to transport them to the next stage of their journey was heavy with memory and light with hope. The war had left wounds, physical, emotional, and moral, that could never fully heal. Yet in these final moments of captivity, they carried with them the knowledge that humanity could persist even in the darkest times. Conversations during the journey back to Germany were tentative, reflective, and at times tearful. Women spoke of the barracks, of meals, of the quiet discipline that had sustained them. They remembered the guards' calm gestures, the small acts of dignity that had been offered daily. Some laughed at the absurdity of it all, incredulous that survival in enemy hands could have been gentler than life under propaganda and fear at home. Others were silent, lost in thought, grappling with the paradox that kindness could exist amidst war, that captors could restore the sense of self stripped away by years of conflict. Upon arrival in Germany, the landscape had changed yet again. Cities lay in ruins, transportation networks were damaged, and the familiar streets carried echoes of chaos. Yet the women approached with a newfound resilience, a calm fortified by months of structured survival. They carried lessons learned in captivity, discipline, patience, solidarity, and the quiet assertion of self-worth that would guide them as they navigated a world still scarred by violence. Even as they confronted shortages, the remnants of bombed-out homes, and the uncertainty of family reunions, they did so with the knowledge that dignity could endure. Years later, when recounting their experiences, these women emphasized not only the hardship of captivity, but the profound human lessons embedded within it. They spoke of the food that nourished not just bodies but hope, of the routines that restored a sense of control, of the small, consistent gestures of respect that reaffirmed their humanity. Above all, they remembered the paradox that those who had once been enemies could offer a form of care and order greater than what they had ever known in their own society at war. That revelation left an indelible mark, shaping their understanding of kindness, resilience, and the unexpected forms of humanity that could survive even in times of profound conflict. The release from captivity was not merely a return to freedom. It was a transition from survival to reflection, from fear to understanding, from despair to cautious hope. For the German women, the lessons learned behind barbed wire endured far longer than the confines of the camp itself. They had been prisoners, yes, but also students of life under conditions that tested both body and spirit. And in the end, what they carried home was not just the memory of captivity, but the knowledge that dignity, decency, and humanity could persist even in the unlikeliest of places. The passage of time in the American camps brought an unexpected clarity. For women who had spent years in Germany fearing collapse and chaos, captivity became a lens through which they could view the war and themselves with new understanding. Life behind the wire was not easy, nor was it free from restriction, yet it offered something the Reich could not: a predictable structure, the smallest assurances of stability, and, astonishingly, respect for their humanity. Days followed a rhythm, each one building upon the last. Morning roll calls came without the threat of violence, meals arrived consistently, and the barracks offered a place to rest without the terror of collapse or bombing overhead. Every detail of daily life, once a source of frustration or fear in their former homes, became a quiet lesson in survival and trust. Clean water, warm meals, the ability to rest without constant vigilance. These were acts that restored a sense of order to lives previously defined by scarcity and destruction. As the weeks passed, disbelief gave way to quiet acceptance. At first, women had feared that the kindness they encountered would vanish at any moment. They had been trained to expect cruelty, to see the enemy as merciless and unyielding. Yet day after day, week after week, they witnessed the opposite. Guards who carried rifles did so with steady hands, not with malice. They spoke firmly, not cruelly, and allowed room for the women to retain a semblance of autonomy within strict limits. That restraint was almost revolutionary for the prisoners. Even small gestures carried profound meaning. A guard might pause to allow a woman to gather her belongings, open a door so she could pass, or offer directions with patience rather than insistence. Each act of measured civility reminded them that, though defeated, they were still people with rights, needs, and dignity. It was in these ordinary moments that the extraordinary lessons of captivity became clear. Humanity could survive even amidst the machinery of war. The women began to reflect not only on the disparity between what they had expected and what they experienced, but also on the contrast with their homeland. Germany, once a place of security and pride, had become a landscape of ruin. Hunger, fear, and destruction had dominated their lives, leaving them hollowed by anxiety. In contrast, captivity offered steady meals, medical care, and a rhythm of life that, while controlled, was reliable. They came to recognize the irony that they had been safer and more cared for in enemy hands than in their own country. These reflections were never simple. Guilt accompanied relief. Many thought of family members struggling in bombed-out homes, and they wrestled with the discomfort of having received food, shelter, and warmth, while loved ones endured deprivation. Others grappled with the cognitive dissonance of acknowledging that the Americans, whom they had been taught to fear and hate, could act with compassion and order. And yet, the lessons of captivity were undeniable. Survival required more than endurance. It required observation, understanding, and adaptation. Within this framework, women began to form new connections, with one another, and with the Americans overseeing their care. Conversations deepened, moving from whispers about daily routines to reflections on the war, morality, and the nature of their captors. They noticed the professionalism of the guards, the attention to detail in the barracks, and the effort to maintain clean, orderly conditions. These observations slowly reshaped perceptions. Enemies could be humane. Discipline did not have to equal cruelty. Even in war, respect for human dignity was possible. Some women began documenting their thoughts, carefully writing letters or keeping secret journals. Each entry became a small act of agency, a reclamation of voice that the war had tried to silence. These records captured astonishment, gratitude, fear, and reflection, the complex emotions stirred by the paradox of captivity. It was a place where they were confined, yet liberated from the daily terror that had defined their lives for so long. Medical care, too, played a critical role in this transformation. Illnesses that had gone untreated at home could now be addressed. Those weakened by months of inadequate food and exposure regained strength. Injuries, infections, and chronic conditions were treated with attention and diligence. To be healed by those they had been conditioned to see as the enemy was bewildering, but life-affirming. Trust, long eroded by propaganda and hardship, began to return in measured increments. The passage of time revealed deeper truths. Captivity did not erase the trauma of war, but it offered a space for reflection and recovery. It demonstrated that structure, kindness, and basic human decency could coexist even in the context of confinement. The women realized that they were learning lessons the war itself had never provided. The value of routine, the power of small gestures, and the resilience of the human spirit when treated with care. As the weeks turned to months, the paradox of captivity became a central feature of memory. They were prisoners, yet they were safer than many who remained free in a devastated country. They were controlled, yet they were allowed the dignity to exist without constant fear. They were defeated, yet they discovered strength and perspective. This duality, at first unsettling, became a source of quiet reflection and ultimately, of insight into the complexity of humanity. When the women were finally released, they carried more than the physical memories of barracks, meals, and fences. They carried an understanding of the paradoxical nature of captivity, that one could be confined yet cared for, controlled yet respected, defeated yet human. These lessons, absorbed slowly over months, would shape their post-war lives and their view of the world. They returned to a Germany still scarred by conflict, but with minds and hearts tempered by the surprising humanity they had encountered behind barbed wire. In the end, the American camps were remembered not only for their function as prisons, but as spaces of unexpected clarity and revelation. They had provided food, shelter, and medical care, yes, but more importantly, they had offered insight into what it meant to be human in a world that had so often denied humanity. For these German women, the paradox of captivity remained a defining memory, one that endured long after the fences were gone. As we close this chapter, it becomes clear that survival is not measured merely by escape or release, nor is defeat defined only by captivity. For the German women in the American camps, survival was found in the smallest of gestures, a calm voice instead of a shout, a tray of warm food instead of neglect, a moment of patience instead of cruelty. These were not grand displays of heroism, but quiet affirmations of humanity, moments that carried far more weight than they could have imagined. They were reminded that even in a world shattered by bombs, hatred, and fear, dignity could endure, compassion could cross enemy lines, and order could coexist with confinement. The paradox of their experience lingered long after the fences faded from view. They had entered expecting only cruelty, yet found structure, care, and above all, respect. It was a revelation that reshaped their understanding of the world, that enemies were not always monsters, that kindness could emerge even in the shadow of conflict, and that the human spirit could survive even the harshest trials. This story asks us to reflect on our own lives and the choices we make in moments of power, of control, of responsibility. It challenges us to see that true strength is often expressed not through dominance but through empathy, patience, and respect. And perhaps the most profound lesson is this: even in the darkest hours, humanity can endure. Even when surrounded by despair, there is room for care, for dignity, for hope. The memory of those women is not just a historical footnote, it is a mirror. It asks each of us, how do we treat those we hold power over? How do we extend compassion when it is easiest to deny it? In answering, we may find that the smallest acts of humanity leave the deepest legacy.